A note for our listeners, this episode contains discussions of sexual violence. Many people remember the hashtag #MeToo from when it went viral in 2017.
The Harvey Weinstein story has brought to light the ugliness, the humiliation, and perhaps most of all, the prevalence of sexual harassment and assault.
It started with this tweet by actress Alyssa Milano, who shared it for a friend, asking anyone who has been sexually assaulted or harassed to write "Me Too" in reply to this.
The hashtag was tweeted nearly 1 million times in just 48 hours. Facebook reported 45% of its users have friends who posted "Me Too."
Before the hashtag, there was the Me Too movement. It was started by activist Tarana Burke in 2006. It was a way to support survivors, particularly Black women and girls. 2026 will mark 20 years since Burke's movement began, and 9 years since the hashtag #MeToo went viral. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we reflect on what's changed since the height of the Me Too movement. Later in the show, journalist Kat Tinbarge talks about social media and the hashtag #MeToo. But up first, Nicole Badera. She's a sociologist who studies sexual violence. She's author of the 2024 book, On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. Nicole, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
In addition to being a researcher, you also worked as a victim advocate. Share with our listeners what that work entails and how it connected to the research that you do.
Yeah, I started out as a victim advocate, and I specifically worked for a rape crisis center. And victim advocates at rape crisis centers, the studies tell us that we're one of the few people that can make the sexual assault reporting process less traumatic for victims. And I worked in the hospitals. So I was working with survivors anywhere from an hour after they were sexually assaulted to a couple of weeks later. And our job there was not to tell anybody what to do or to really affect the outcome in any way. Our job was to help survivors understand how much their life had changed and answer their questions about all of the decisions they have to make really quickly. And victim advocates, I think this is really important to know in our current political moment. That's a confidential job. That meant we could not be subpoenaed. That meant we were one of the only places in the world where survivors could talk to us about things that they were worried might come out somewhere else. And so a lot of the questions that we got were things like, if I continue with the reporting process, can I get deported? Or if I was drinking underage, could I go to jail for that?
I notice in how you just responded, but also throughout the book, you are very careful and intentional about language. So you are very intentional about using the language of survivor and perpetrator instead of the terms victim or attacker. Talk to us about that attention to the language and how it is so important to your approach to this work.
One of the reasons I use the word survivor is that researchers know that survivors tend to feel more supported by people who use that language. There's a sense that you know what they're up against, that you know that the sexual assault isn't over. That's one of the big things that researchers know and the general public doesn't. It's just because you reach the conclusion of the physical violence, there's often still a lot of psychological violence or violence that's continuing in different forms like harassment or stalking that's taking place. And so I use the word survivor because it acknowledges that. In the book, I do use the word victim too, but I only use it in situations where there are victims who did not survive. And then for perpetrator, people are really uncomfortable with that word, especially on places like college campuses, which is where I did the research. They would prefer to obscure the violence that was committed. They prefer to use words like respondent, the accused, or some people wouldn't even use that. Some people would call them party number two. The victim was party number one and the perpetrator was party number two. But that really focused on their roles within these processes, a presumption that a victim, for example, did come forward, which a lot of the times they weren't able to do that because of the very system I was studying. One of the big findings of the book is that in the vast majority of sexual violence cases on a college campus, the only person who is ever involved is the survivor. and that the university shuts down that complaint, shuts down that reporting process before a perpetrator would ever be involved, before he would ever have to try to defend himself. That's something the university is doing on his behalf. And so perpetrator was the only word that made sense.
This is a book that focuses on sexual violence, sexual assault, and Title IX. You and I, Nicole, were sort of bantering before we started, talking about where we went to graduate school, two schools that happen to be big sports rivals. And often when people hear Title IX, they only think about athletics. And your work pushes back against that to show that sexual assault is intimately tied to Title IX. Talk to us about how gender-based discrimination plays into this work.
The reason people think about sports and Title IX is because that's one of the first places that feminists were able to politicize how much sex-based discrimination was happening on a college campus. So if your university, if you go back to the 80s, and your university only had men's athletics and didn't offer any athletics for women, we still are having quite the concerning discussion about more gender expansive framings of athletics too. But if you were looking at that during that time, it was a really clear example to say, why is there a men's football team and there's no women's basketball team, for example? And so that's where a lot of the Title IX discussion started, because it was so glaring, the amount of discrimination that was taking place. Sexual violence is the next place that was the most glaring on a college campus. And that's because the sexual violence rate on a college campus, it actually hasn't changed at all since our university's gender integrated. The most conservative estimates would tell us that 1 in 5 women are experiencing a sexual assault. There are a lot of numbers that come in higher than that, which I would say are the more rigorous methods to find the truth there. And we see the same thing for other gender marginalized students, for transgender and non-binary students, for students that have any kind of queer identity as well. There might be an even higher sexual violence rate. And so the reason this matters as a type of sex discrimination, and that's the way the law thinks of sexual violence, is not as something that's immoral or wrong, or we're thinking of it as a crime, although it is all of those things. The law considers sexual violence to be illegal on a college campus in an additional way, because when someone experiences sexual violence during their education, it makes their education worse. They get a worse experience than someone who didn't experience that. And it's not just for the survivors themselves, but for anybody who knows they're at risk. So if you look back at the original case law that made sexual assault a form of sex discrimination on a college campus, there were 2 types of plaintiffs. One was survivors who felt like they had to make their campus lives smaller to avoid their perpetrators. We know now in the research that there are a lot of other negative impacts too. For example, studies find that sexual violence history is the best known predictor of a college woman's grades. It predicts whether or not women will graduate at all. It's also one of the best predictors of why a woman who starts out in a STEM degree, like engineering, doesn't complete that degree. And they end up doing something more feminine, a more female-dominated discipline that tends to be lower paid. So that was one type of plaintiff. The other type of plaintiff in this case were the friends of that survivor, who knew as well, I'm at risk, so I need to avoid this professor's classes. I need to avoid this professor's office hours. The professor, in this case, was the perpetrator. And so they too were making their lives smaller on campus, and all the things they were doing to support survivors because the school offered them nothing. That too was taking away their money, was taking away their time. Every time women are told, well, if you're scared on campus, just get a buddy, walk across campus at night together. That's a form of sex discrimination.
You were studying sexual violence during the height of what we now know as the Me Too movement, knowing that Tarana Burke almost 20 years ago launched Me Too to really pay attention to the ways that girls and women, particularly at that time, Black girls and women, were experiencing sexual violence. But then in 2017, it becoming this sort of viral movement in a very different way. Remind us what was happening on college campuses in 2017 or around that time of the movement as you were conducting your research.
For the data that I was collecting in 2016, before Me Too went viral, it was really common when we ask survivors, a question I ask in every study that I conduct with survivors. I say, who did you tell? And how did they respond? And in 2016, we would commonly hear, I haven't told anyone but you. I would say about half of our participants had told one or fewer people. And a lot of the time, the reason they hadn't told anybody is because they had told that first person, that person blamed them. They said, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z? You should have protected yourself better. And then the shame would lead the victims to go back into secrecy. Or maybe the person they told said, I don't believe you. I know you're a perpetrator. I think he's a good guy. And so then again, there was a sense of we shouldn't tell anybody. And then I was collecting data for that study the week Me Too went viral. And I can't emphasize how wild it was that immediately when we asked that question, we would start to hear participants say, oh, everyone knows this about me. I put it on Facebook. I put it on Twitter. I identify publicly as a survivor. And when we said, how did people respond? They said, I got so much support. People really care about this. Now, fast forward to 2018, which when I was conducting the research for the book, I still saw that happening. And then the Kavanaugh hearing happened. And I remember the week of the Kavanaugh hearing, I was interviewing a survivor who had reported to her university. And so this survivor, I'd met her before the Kavanaugh hearing. And at the time, she had been so enthusiastic. She said, I feel like a superhero. I'm a part of this bigger movement. I think I'm doing something really good. I'm really proud of myself. And then her case came to a close the same week of the Kavanaugh hearing. And what she said in that moment was, I should have known better. The reason we have to have this movement is because the system doesn't work. We can't trust it. And all of a sudden, she started to feel really deflated and saying, what was I thinking coming forward? And I hated that that was the way she put it, that her thought was not, yes, she was upset at the system, but there was also a sense of, I should have known better. Why did I think that things would be different for me when I've heard all these stories of things being bad for others? And I don't think that should have been her burden to bear, to be honest. It's the system that failed, not the people who wish the system were doing better. That's not who we blame here. But fast forward to now, with research I was collecting data over the summer, we're back to where we were pre-Me Too, where about half of the participants we interviewed, when we said, how have you told anybody else about what happened to you? How did they respond? They said, you're the first people we've told. And my understanding of how we got from a place that was so bad and so isolating to a moment of hope back to that bad, isolating place is that we didn't get to really make a lot of the gains of that Me Too moment, which is different than the Me Too movement, but that Me Too moment, we didn't turn them into structure. There wasn't a lot of policy that was passed as the result of Me Too. Our criminal justice system hasn't changed at all as the result of Me Too. And Me Too, I was watching school administrators try to decide how to handle Title IX, and they were not making any changes in light of Me Too. And so we were getting a lot of lip service from institutions that claim they would do better. And we trusted them when they said they were going to do better. But as it turns out, what they were doing is something sociologists call symbolic compliance, which is where they tell us that they're going to do a good job, that they're going to become compliant with the law. Because that's one of the things that's really tricky about sexual violence is it is illegal. A lot of the systems in place, if they were actually enforced as written, we'd be in a much different situation than we are right now, but that there's very low levels of compliance with civil rights law. And so they just told us, we'll do better. We hoped they would, but ultimately, these are patriarchal institutions. And when they looked back at their toolkits of how they wanted to handle things, there were a lot of people at the table who said, we don't want to change anything at all. And ultimately, they didn't. And sexual violence is overwhelmingly a problem that affects younger people. The risk of sexual assault declines significantly for women after the age of 24. For men, the risk declines significantly once they reach sexual maturity, once they become teenagers. A lot of men's experiences of sexual violence is really childhood sexual abuse of boys. And so when we didn't make those structural changes to places like the school system, That means the new cohort of survivors who don't even remember Me Too because they were too young to be having those types of conversations with their parents, didn't want to talk about it with them. Their friends are children as well. Their teachers in some states are banned from talking to them about it. That means that all of those changes could be erased more quickly than they would for a different kind of civil rights movement because sexual violence is so much an issue of the young.
Coming up, more with sociologist Nicole Badera. She shares what she thinks it will take to end sexual violence.
Sexual violence doesn't exist in places that don't tolerate it.
And later, Kat Tinbarge talks about being a student journalist in 2017.
So our broadcast studio was actually called the Roger E. Ailes newsroom. And the night that those allegations came out against him, people went up to the newsroom and pried the letters off the wall.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. A reminder for our listeners, this episode contains discussions of sexual violence. This hour, we reflect on the Me Too movement and how people talk about sexual violence today. We're still joined by sociologist Nicole Badera, author of On the Wrong Side, How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. I wanted to talk to Nicole about presidential leadership in addressing sexual violence. We are still in the first half of President Trump's second term, and he hasn't spoken extensively about how he will handle sexual assault on campus, but he has returned Title IX enforcement to the rules he put in place during his first term. Ask Nicole what we should be paying attention to in the current administration as compared to the Biden administration.
Like you've said, Trump hasn't talked that much about sexual violence, although he has done a lot around Title IX in his most recent term. And one of the reasons that he hasn't focused that much on sexual violence is that Title IX was his test case for stripping us of our civil rights within our institutions. And there's a long history of this. A lot of the time, sexual violence becomes a political football, and it becomes one of those issues that oppressive politicians can pick up and put down as they want to. And if you can get people on board with the idea that, for example, a perpetrator deserves impunity for raping someone, that we should look the other way when they do that, that's a gateway to normalizing other types of violence that people might have found more egregious. And one of the reasons that that's true, one of the reasons it works is because sexual violence is so common. It's one of the types of violence that we are all the most likely to encounter in our lifetimes, either as survivors ourselves, as perpetrators, or as the bystanders of people who are involved in something like an abusive relationship. And it's so close to home that it's easy for politicians to convince a lot of people to think it's not a big deal because they already have some practice doing it when it got so close to home, when it happened right in front of them, and they didn't know what to do. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot in this moment is that everything that Trump is doing with a lot of these other institutions, I feel like I can almost see the future as someone who knew Title IX and knows Title IX so well because it's the exact same playbook. And so that brings us to the second term. And what is happening now is during Trump's first term, he really gutted protections for survivors. One of the things that Trump did with his Title IX regulation in his first term is he literally made it so that perpetrators could remove their confessions from evidence. And so now in this term, we're now seeing this shift into viewing gender marginalized people as the problem and acting as if the dominant group, which are men, in this case, as if they are the ones who are oppressed. And so we're seeing now things like the closures of women's centers, the ending of women's scholarships. We're seeing that gender marginalized students, specifically transgender and non-binary students, are being banned from participating in sports. And that is already leading to the closure of women's athletics. That all of these new burdens that have been put on women, because that's who's shouldering a lot of them too, is cisgender women, when they now have to go through, for example, medical confirmation of their gender, and their sports were already underfunded, journalists are starting to find that, especially at the K through 12 level, women's sports, girls' sports are just being closed, or they're becoming entirely co-ed. But what we're seeing is this hostility and this use of Title IX. It went from just in his first term, it wouldn't be protective of survivors. And now we're moving into a period of time where it is protective of perpetrators. In terms of the types of things we're seeing on college campuses in Trump's second term, we're seeing that when someone experiences violence, maybe there's not a victim advocacy center for them to get help with, or that victim advocacy center exists, but they refuse the types of supports that used to be so commonplace before. We're also seeing things like a rise of retaliatory complaints, which is when a perpetrator abuses the Title IX system as a weapon against their victim. And they'll try to say that they were the one who was hurt and that they are the one who deserves the university to surveil their victim, to punish their victim on their behalf. And the perpetrators tend to be more successful in these pursuits than survivors who ever used Title IX. In terms of the question of how does Biden fit into all of this, if you look back at the very end of Trump's term, Democrats in the House actually asked President Biden to reverse Trump's Title IX regulation within the first 100 days and to put an emergency measure in place instead. And Biden refused to do that. And when we did finally get the rule that he put out was a compromise between the previous civil rights approach that said that sexual violence was wrong and that survivors deserve support. And then he fit in all of the most controversial things that Trump did, all of the most dangerous things that Trump put into the process. And he told schools essentially, you can pick. You can pick if you want to give students their civil rights, or you can pick if you don't want to give them their civil rights. This is all kind of a long way of saying that if we'd all hoped that Biden was going to reverse the damage of Trump, and if we hoped that he was going to defend students' civil rights around sexual violence and sex discrimination, he just didn't do it. And if anything, having a Democrat basically put a stamp of approval on what Trump had done led it to feel normalized. And so when I was working on the book, there were a lot of liberal and progressive identified people on university campuses who were horrified by Trump's approach. But if you go back to a university campus now, you'll find often some of the exact same people defending the approach because it was something that came from Biden. And they said it's actually not as bad as we thought.
When we think about the way forward, the path forward, because as your work says, these issues are not going away, what then is the power of social media to either counter some of the misinformation or to amplify that misinformation that can become a challenge to actual having sound policy and process that actually supports the kind of justice and accountability? What's the role of social media in all of this?
What a tricky question, because I think we've seen both extremes around sexual violence. Me Too going viral showed us the positive power of social media. But there were a lot of things that were different about social media at that time. Things like who owned Twitter and content moderation policies at that period of time were a lot better. Some of the research that I've been working on recently is around people's experiences of sexual violence online. And we're seeing these huge differences in survivors' experiences between, again, that pre-2016 period and now. And that in the past, if someone was harassing you on social media, you could report it to Facebook and Facebook would ban the user. And now, I mean, Facebook is a great example of they've said that they no longer want to address issues of gender and that they are now permitting a lot of gendered slurs to be used overtly on their platform. And so part of what we need to look to is the practices of our social media platforms, because it's really hard for something like Me Too to happen where people are sharing their vulnerable stories of sexual assault if they're going to be harassed in their mentions, if their stalker might be able to see everything that they're posting and might be able to get information about them. And that's becoming a more difficult environment. And then at the same time, we've seen that misogynistic groups have gotten much better and more powerful in harnessing social media. The example that comes to mind for me is Depp v. Heard, that there was so much misinformation spread about that case. And now there's been deep investigative journalistic inquiries into what happened. And it's clear that there were just a few key actors with a lot of money and a lot of resources that were paying to promote that kind of content. And a lot of that content was coming from bots, not from real people, which, by the way, you could kind of sense at the time, because the second that you wrote the word Depp on Twitter, there would be harassment showing up in your mentions. And it was too fast for it to be people. It was really, really quick. And so, again, this is something that social media companies could have done something about. It had all the hallmarks of a bot. They were engaging in harassment, not just disinformation, but harassment. And there's a time where those posts would have been removed and those bad actors that were having this outsized influence could have disappeared entirely, but that didn't happen. And the other thing I want to name here when we're talking about misinformation is the misinformation campaign around sexual violence and around college sexual violence in particular hasn't just happened online. We've seen the government engaging in misinformation efforts and disinformation efforts. And we're also seeing that a lot of our institutions that could have held them accountable have remained silent. When it comes to campus sexual assault, the entire public discourse was about whether or not men could remain in school. There was this real focus on, are our Title IX officers going too far? Are they expelling too many perpetrators? Will my son be able to get a college degree? Was really the tenor of a lot of the coverage in places like the New York Times during that political moment. But our universities had the data of how few students they were expelling. And now that it's been made public, we know that the average university at the peak, at the height of their best Title IX enforcement, expelled one perpetrator every 3 years. So we had this entire public debate about whether or not Title IX had gone too far that was completely untethered from reality. But the institutions that knew that reality didn't want people to know they were non-compliant with civil rights law. They didn't want to admit that they had been violating survivors' rights for so many decades. And that's part of how we get to this place. And so when it comes to countering disinformation, one of the things that I think all of us can do, especially if we're in positions of authority, is be honest about the shortcomings of our own approaches, be honest about the things that we see that alarm us, and to stop trying to cover up how bad the problem is.
For our listeners who will hear this conversation, it resonates with them, and say, in addition to the things you have mentioned, what's working that we could double down on and make it better? Or what is something that you would say you really want people to consider as an action of how we can address this crisis that's happening on college campuses? What's your message?
One of the things that I say a lot is that I'm not doing a lot of research these days. After finishing this book, I think a lot of people would expect I'd have more questions than answers, and I did not feel that way at all, especially when I dug into some of those harder to find academic literatures, research by feminists, by other civil rights scholars, dating back, I think, 50 years. I found that we actually have the answer to how to end sexual violence. And that answer is that sexual violence doesn't exist in places that don't tolerate it. And so what we really have to focus on when you're thinking about what the right response is, you have to think about, how can I be intolerant to this violence? And how can I support the needs of survivors? So many of our conversations are focused on what do we do about the perpetrator. And I've just found across the board that if we look at what a survivor needs in the moment and we prioritize meeting the survivor's needs, the path to nonviolence is really, really clear. So, for example, researchers now know that how traumatic a sexual assault is not determined by just the act of violence itself. It's equally as determined by how everybody in the survivor's life treats them. If they go to an institution, like they report to the police or they go to their university, do they get support or do they get blame? Do they get believed or are they told it didn't matter? And so all of us actually have the capacity to make sexual assault less traumatic. I mean, it's really a very simple formula. We have to respect survivors' autonomy. That's the thing that was taken from them in the sexual assault, and to heal, they need it back. And then when it comes to preventing the violence, the part that is about perpetrators is there's a real tendency for us to think, people think about them in this binary. They either think about them as people who can never be reached and they're a lost cause, so why even bother? Or they think about them as everybody deserves a second chance, so let's hope they do better in the future. But it's really rare for somebody to look at the moment in the aftermath of a sexual assault and say, how would we want the perpetrator's behavior to change to make things easier on the victim? And in my research, I just found that's really important because I said this a little bit before, but a lot of the time, the sexual assault is not the end of the violence for the victim. The perpetrator will go around smearing their reputation. They'll make defamatory statements about them. They'll be harassing them. They might be stalking them or trying to control their behavior, trying to intimidate them in some way. And that's a moment that if we as a society could look at that and say, all right, we didn't get to see the sexual assault for ourselves, but we see everything that the perpetrator is doing now. We're not okay with it. We won't tolerate it, and we're not going to help. We'd be in a really different situation than the one we're in. And I do think we have to get more comfortable with recognizing that sexual violence has consequences. We can't get back to the moment from before the violence took place. And to say, how do we put those consequences on the shoulders of the person who had a choice, the perpetrator who chose to be violent, instead of on the victim who didn't get to choose to be there? One of my favorite examples for victims who've experienced sexual abuse in their families is a wedding or a funeral. And the way most people will respond is they'll say, I know that there was violence between these two people in the past. I don't know what happened. I'm just going to invite everybody to my wedding, and anybody who's comfortable can come, and anyone who isn't comfortable doesn't have to come. That will mean in almost every case, the survivor is the one who doesn't come. And one of the things that I would really challenge people to do is to be more intentional about taking the right side. The book is called On the Wrong Side. We need to take the right side. It's okay to have an opinion about violence. It's okay to take the side of the survivor. It's the right thing to do to take the side of the survivor. And so when you are the person supporting a survivor in your personal life, to say to them, I'm having a wedding and I want you to come. What do you need? And to some degree, even if they say they'd be okay with their perpetrator being there, we actually know from the research that they're not. And so one of the consequences of being violent is things like missing a wedding, is things like maybe you have to go to a different school. And those types of really simple interventions that, again, the guide is what will help the survivor right now, they make a huge difference. And we know that when people respond that way, that creates these safe havens where all of a sudden there are no perpetrators here anymore. This is a place where they know there will be consequences for their actions. They're not going to engage in violence. And this is a place where people can come and be safe and know they're safe.
And I think it's also a reminder that we need to move beyond our individual discomfort to really help people stand in their power and stand in their dignity, especially for those who have that experience of having their dignity undermined. Nicole Badera is a sociologist who studies sexual violence. She's author of On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, we talk with journalist Kat Tinbarge. She'll tell us about the role of social media in shaping the way that people think about sexual assault cases.
My perspective on social media and its consequences is always that we have to look at the good and the bad.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. A reminder for our listeners, this episode contains discussions of sexual violence. This hour, we're reflecting on the Me Too movement and how people talk about sexual violence today. The prevalence of the hashtag #MeToo was made possible by social media. But social media is also a place where criticism can thrive. To help us break down the complex online environment around sexual assault, we're joined now by Kat Tinbarge. She's an award-winning independent journalist who covers internet culture, politics, and sexual violence. She's co-founder of Spitfire News. Kat, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much for having me.
When the hashtag #MeToo went viral, you were a student journalist at Ohio University. And I wonder if you can share a little bit about the reactions on campus. It's hard to believe that we are almost 20 years past the beginning of these efforts. Remind us and share with us what you were hearing and seeing on your campus.
For us, one of the really big sort of reckonings was in the dominoes that started to fall after Harvey Weinstein. We had Matt Lauer was one of our most famous graduates from the School of Journalism, and Roger E. Ailes was another one. So our broadcast studio was actually called the Roger E. Ailes Newsroom. And the night that those allegations came out against him, people went up to the newsroom and pried the letters off the wall. So there was an imprint of those like metal letters on the wall, a very visible signal to everyone on campus that this reckoning was happening. And I think it was a moment that really excited a lot of young journalists because it was a symbol of change and it was a symbol of what could be even during the Trump era.
And I interviewed Tarana Burke some years ago, and I remember something she said that stays with me to this day. And she said, watch who they call your leaders. Unfortunately, there's a tendency in our society and in our culture to treat victims and survivors as if they have to justify why they didn't deserve the harm that they received, or why they, as survivors, need to prove that they weren't complicit in that harm. It is disgusting. It is disheartening. And yet, to understand what it takes for someone to bravely step forward to say, this happened to me, it was not okay, and I want to make sure that others are not suffering because of that shame and stigma that was never theirs to carry, and yet, as you said, those platforms make a difference in that. I'm thinking also, Kat, of a lot of the public conversation that we've seen around these high-profile celebrity allegations. And I always go back to, what does that mean to the average person in your life who has been a survivor or has been in this situation and sees the way that people defend those they don't know while overlooking those that they do? How then are social media platforms regulating any of this, or at least trying to be a buffer from that kind of harm that comes around gender-based violence and harassment? What do you see on social media?
In general, with social media, it amplifies all of the pre-existing biases in our society, and it amplifies and can distort sort of the systemic failures that already exist in offline settings. So, for example, anyone who studies sexual violence and abuse is familiar with the ways that law enforcement and the court system and the media has long failed survivors by creating the structural inequities that harm survivors every single day. And so with social media discourse and the landscape of these platforms, we see a lot of that amplified. We see a lot of backlash and harassment campaigns directed towards survivors, especially in a long-term sense. Something that I always try to convey to people is that the first day that these allegations break, the day that the story is published, the day that the individual comes forward on social media, they will often receive a largely positive response. There will be this wave of support. But in the following days and weeks and months and years, that wave of support recedes, but the backlash and the antagonism and the harassment often lasts indefinitely. So that's a big factor with these social media platforms. And there is essentially little to no moderation that takes place in these cases. A lot of things that happen on social media do not get flagged and do not get taken seriously by these platforms when it comes to harming vulnerable populations, which includes survivors. In fact, what I frequently see and have actually seen more and more over the years is that platforms will take moderation actions against the survivors for sharing their stories, particularly when survivors attempt to document what happened to them and then share that documentation on social media. That's when content will get struck and removed.
There's a lot of conversation happening, not enough, but a lot of conversation happening about young people's engagement with social media in terms of the places that they seek information, the accuracy of that information, the amount of time that they are exposed to these repeated messages. Is there space, Kat, for us to actually use this as a positive socialization space for young people who may not be facing these issues today, but at some point will encounter these things? Am I being naive and too hopeful to think that we could do that with social media?
I don't think you are, because my perspective on social media and its consequences is always that we have to look at the good and the bad. And the reality is there is a lot of positive social change that has emerged with these social media platforms as the conduit, including the hashtag #MeToo movement and sort of the network effect that it inspired. And we saw this in 2017, we saw this again in 2020, and I imagine that we will continue to see this, which is that when someone comes forward and their allegations, their experience, and their telling of it gains a lot of attention, you see it embolden other people to speak out. When one domino falls, dominoes around it also fall. And so we've seen this time and time again where people are inspired by what they see others do, and that can lead to really positive change. The other side of that we also have to take into consideration is that there is a danger in coming forward on social media. There is a danger in sharing your experiences. And I think people don't always see that side of it because they see that viral sort of applause and support, and they don't always see sort of the longer term consequences that I was talking about, the harassment, the scrutiny. They don't always see the retaliatory legal actions that can take place, the defamation lawsuits. And people don't always put two and two together that victims who are sharing their real experiences can also face these sorts of retaliatory measures. A lot of times the narrative we see is we hear about false allegations and we hear about people who are weaponizing the Me Too movement to make these so-called false allegations. The reality is that there's a lot more nuance, and people are branded liars. People are branded as making these false allegations, even if they're not, even if they were telling the truth.
I think there's this dual harm of constantly feeling like you have to defend yourself, and the other side of that being how often people who come forward to name their harm then become a sort of mascot, right? That people don't deal with when you're home by yourself and no one else is around. Those thoughts don't go away, or that kind of emotional work of, I'm a full person who deserves to be viewed as a full person and not just this horrible thing that happened to me. How we do all of that. That, Kat, becomes complicated by this concept that you often cover in your writing called DARVO. Talk to our listeners about DARVO and how it influences not just the conversations about sexual violence, but the kind of after effects of a person coming forward with the claim. Talk to us about DARVO.
What DARVO stands for is deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. What that looks like is if an individual says, you were abusive to me during our relationship, the offender could employ a DARVO strategy to deny those allegations and actually counter accuse the victim of being the real abuser in the relationship. We also see this rhetoric extend more broadly. Institutions can do this to people. The public at large can do this to people. And so DARVO often goes hand in hand with the concept that Dr. Fried also created called institutional betrayal. And we saw this happen a lot during the Me Too movement and in the aftermath of a lot of these high-profile allegations. We saw in sort of the reactionary backlash, this desire to blame victims and to judge survivors harshly, sort of in the process, displacing the blame and the responsibility onto the survivors. And so DARVO is something that I look at a lot because it plays into so many of these cases. And in fact, when I speak to survivors, a lot of times what I hear is that this process of having the blame be shifted onto you by the police, by the court system, by the media, by the public, that can be more traumatizing than the initial act of abuse.
That element and dynamic of power is often why perpetrators continue to inflict harm because they know that it is a power differential. And again, this doesn't have to be a famous person or a celebrity.
Right.
It is any way that a person can use that shame to hold over someone's head and to know that as long as someone is silent, that power is shifted in those ways. And is often why when we hear about a person committing a harm, it is often not the first time that they committed a harm. It may be the first time that it was publicly stated. You have been a student journalist. You are now an award-winning, I like saying that, award-winning independent journalist at Spitfire News. What do you say to other journalists who think, yes, this is important, but it's just not simply worth me taking this on because of all of the challenges and threats? What do you say to journalists who have that fear and concern?
It's a great question. And I think that understandably, a lot of journalists may not be equipped to be able to handle this type of coverage and all of what it entails. And first and foremost, I would say to journalists who can recognize that about themselves, that can actually be a strength to know what you can and cannot do. And in fact, I would urge journalists who feel like they are not equipped to cover this topic and to cover these types of stories, then I would say don't. Because I think, unfortunately, all too often you have people who are not intentional about the way that they're handling this coverage be put in these situations where the consequences for survivors can be amplified by irresponsibility in the media. And so I think that this is so important to get right and such a serious topic that only people who do feel capable and qualified of covering it should be in that position. At the same time, I think if a journalist wants to do this type of storytelling, but is scared to do so, it really does come down to a person's own sort of comfortability and what they can handle and what they can shoulder. But I would urge people who just have that anxiety to take that step, because in my own personal experience, there have been many times when I've been afraid of what types of blowback I may experience for doing specific types of coverage. And after going through it, what I can say is that those consequences are real. There will be negative impacts on sort of your life and how you feel, but I would do it over and over and over again if given the opportunity, because sort of the gratitude I have and the positive consequences that this has had on my life, to me, it makes all of the difference. That may not be the case for everyone. And I think people have different vulnerabilities that are important to consider. But I would encourage people who are passionate and willing to do this work to pursue it, because it is so vital. And the storytelling that we do as journalists and as creators, it has such far-reaching impacts. I've received so many messages from people who have been abused, who have been violated, who have been taken advantage of. And in reading responsible storytelling about these experiences, it is empowering to them.
This is such a challenging topic. It is one that people often shy away from because it is so layered and so complex. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that your work affirms not only our responsibility, but our sense of agency, that there are ways that we can have difficult conversations, that we can take action collectively, that brings people together rather than making people feel like they have to be on a side or another. What does it mean to come together and be on the side of right and healing and of justice? And so we appreciate your work in that domain. Kat Tinbarge is an award-winning independent journalist covering internet culture, politics, and sexual violence. She's co-founder of Spitfire News. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you so much.
If you've experienced sexual violence, there's help and support. You can call RAIN's National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-HOPE. 4673. You can also text the word HOPE to 64673. Special thanks to our former intern, Tale Ricketson, for producing this episode. This episode was also produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. and you can find us wherever you get your podcast. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Thanks for listening.